If you know of anyone that missed it or there's any information you'd like to review, it will be available on the ICPN website. I'm going to wait just a second. It looks like Donna is typing in here. No problem. Great. We've got Donna connected, and it looks like all of you are connected. It's 11 o'clock. We will get started here this morning. My name is Bronwyn Eves, and I'm the project manager for the Illinois Collections Preservation Network. Thank you all for being here today, and welcome to our webinar. I'd also like to thank the Illinois State Library for the support of this webinar today, and especially to Debbie Aggert for her technical support in getting us to this point today. I need to mention that this program and all ICPN programs would not be possible without the support of the ICPN Steering Committee partners and the IMLS who supported our grant that brings us here today. Thank you for that. Before we get into our preservation topic today, I'd like to share with you a little bit of history of the ICPN. In 2009, a group of preservation professionals from several libraries, museums, and historical societies received an IMLS Connecting to Collections planning grant. During the course of this one-year grant, the partners led discussions across the state to identify preservation needs of collecting institutions. A survey of around 300 institutions revealed that there's a great demand for preservation training and support among Illinois preservation professionals. The survey information was used to write a statewide preservation plan, form the ICPN, and apply for an IMLS Connecting to Collections implementation grant. In 2011, Illinois was one of only 6 states to receive that implementation grant. You can find much more information on our website, including a list of our grant partners and additional programming that we have planned for the upcoming year. Briefly, some of our program highlights are offering free in-person disaster recovery workshops in which participants will learn about disaster preparation, writing your plan, working on disaster recovery and response as well. And we even offer a hands-on mini salvage exercise at the end of the day-long workshop. We've held 4 of these workshops, and we have 1 remaining workshop in Freeport, Illinois on July 9th. If you're able to join us, please send me an email and I'll add you to that list. We also will be hosting some fire recovery workshops in next spring, and we'll have more information about that once we get the date set on our website. We also have compiled a series of tools that will be made available to institutions to borrow. These can be used to monitor and maintain environmental conditions in your storage areas. We have data loggers, vacuums. If you're writing a grant and need to gather some of this information, please contact me and I'll get you more information about borrowing those free of charge. And we also have been awarding scholarships to the Campbell Center for Historic Preservation Studies. We've awarded 8 of our 10 scholarships. We do have 2 $500 scholarships remaining, so if there's a course you've been wanting to take at the Campbell Center, again, please contact me and I can get you the application materials. Thanks again for engaging with ICPN today, and I know that you're really going to enjoy this webinar. I now have the great pleasure to introduce our presenter for today. Photo Preservation Part 1 is our topic, and Jennifer Hain Tepper is our presenter. Jennifer is the head of Preservation and Conservation Program at the University of Illinois. She's trained as a book and paper conservator, and in her current position also oversees staff working on the preservation of photographs, audiovisual materials, and digital content held by the library. Thank you, Jennifer, for being here today. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Bronwyn. Everybody hear me okay? Or at least somebody hear me okay, so I know I'm transmitting through? Excellent. Wonderful. So unfortunately, for whatever reason, my PowerPoint has not wanted to upload to the webinar interface that we're using. So I'm going to go ahead and do this through my desktop, which should work just fine, except that I won't be able to see the online chat. So Bronwyn has graciously offered to go ahead and monitor the chat for me. So if you have a question that's really relevant to a particular slide that we're seeing, she'll go ahead and basically notify me that I've got a question and I can flip over and respond to that. But if you have a question that isn't relevant to something we're actually all seeing on the slide at that particular time, I'd appreciate it if we leave our questions until the end. Hopefully I'll be able to get to all of them but that'll make it so that we don't have to flip and toggle back and forth between the two programs. So I appreciate if you do that. I will try my best to leave time at the end for questions and conversation about photos. So what we're going to cover today, and let me let's see. I am going to have to start sharing. There we go. And let me just flip over here. Sorry, you get to see all the innards this way. Okay, so what we're going to be going over today is the identification and care of photographic and still image materials. And actually, we're not going to be covering care all that much, only tangentially today. The meat of the care of photographs, display, exhibit, that sort of stuff is going to actually be in the second part of this workshop, which we're doing in a few weeks. So most of today is actually about identification of what you own, but some relevant information on care will be interspersed with this one, but certainly it's not the meat of that content. Wanted to start with a few resources that we have available here. Oh, and I can see the messages. They pop up as little windows on my screen. So actually, I can see when people chat. I just have to read really quickly before it goes away. So that's good to know. And thank you for posting that next date. So I have 4 resources that I want to reference people to, 3 that are directly related to the topic that we're covering today, and then 1 that is a little tangential. When I give a broader version of this workshop, it's more directly related, but it's still really useful to note. The first one is James Riley's Care and Identification of 19th Century Photographic Prints. This was originally published by Eastman Kodak Company in 1986, and they did several runs of reprints because it is a perennially popular title, but Kodak has scaled back considerably over the years, and their publishing efforts have scaled back with them. So the Image Permanence Institute, the IPI, has actually reprinted this as recently as 2009 and still has that available on the IPI's website. So if you just Google Image Permanence Institute and then look in their resources, you'll be able to find it. This is a really great reference for a multitude of reasons. One is that it's just very, very well written. It's not particularly thick. It's only, half an inch thick, maybe 100 pages tops. Has great illustrations, but what makes it really worthwhile is not just all the information that it holds, but it comes with a poster that actually aids in the identification. So if you're working with photographic collections frequently, this poster is an absolute go-to resource for photographic identification when you're dealing with historic processes like those in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And what it does is actually compares eyeballs on photographs under just standard loop magnification, which is like a little eye magnifier like jewelers use, to be able to lead you through the identification process, and shows the different prints under the same magnification, showing the same content which they've chosen to be an eyeball. But it does get across the sense of how to tell these different print formats apart. So this is a really great resource. Mary Lynn Ritzenthaler and Diane Boyd O'Connor very recently released, 2006, released Photographs, Archival Care and Management. This is through SAA. This is not a cheap publication, but it is available through interlibrary loan and at lots of resource libraries if you're not a member of SAA. With the SAA membership, you do get a pretty deep discount on purchasing publications, so that might be the way to go as well if you're a member of the Society of American Archivists. But this is a fantastic resource if you're interested in the management of photographic collections. So this doesn't talk nearly as much about identifying processes, assumes that you actually know what sort of processes you're dealing with, but talks about arrangement, description, housing, and general management and servicing of photographic collections. So this can be really, really helpful to those of you who have large photograph collections and are interested in how to manage those. The third, which is the one that's tangential, is Bamber Gascoign's How to Identify Prints, and this is in its 2nd edition now. The first edition, I believe, was in the late 90s. Second edition is 2004, and this is through Thames and Hudson. And I love this. Bamber Gascoigne, alone, I have to reference this only because his name is so awesome. But this is actually a very, very good book on identifying printing processes. And included within those are photoreprographic processes. So processes like halftones, photogravures, rotogravures, which if this were my larger workshop, I would actually be able to cover today. But in trying to keep this down to an hour, I'm not able to cover photoreprographic processes, but I'm only covering true photographs. But this will lead you through how to identify prints that were once photographs but have now become a printing process, and how to tell those apart from photographs, or how to identify those and what process it is. So this can be really, really helpful. And then lastly is the Image Permanence Institute and their Graphics Atlas program. The IPI, as I mentioned earlier with their reprint of Jim Riley's book, really is one of the leaders in photographic care, preservation, identification, and one of the tools that they've made available is this Graphics Atlas program. And so I wanted to take you on a quick tour through that, because a lot of the snapshots that I'm using today in the workshop I actually have pulled from Graphics Atlas. Actually, the lion's share of them I pulled from Graphics Atlas because it's such an excellent visual resource. And so I wanted to show that to you. To hop over here. So it's just graphicsatlas.org. And I know this is probably a little bit small on your screen. I apologize. It's just the resolution of the website and the way it opens. Obviously, if you're having trouble reading any content, it's not really important that you do that right now, but that you just know what the website does and what the website address is. So basically what it does is there is a guided tour available, which I'm not going to take us through now, but it kind of just introduces you to Graphics Atlas and what this program does. It allows you to compare processes. So let's say you have processes that you're trying to discern whether or not it's, let's say a printing out silver gelatin print versus a glossy or matte collodion print. You can actually compare their stock photographs and those different processes and see the differences between them that will hopefully aid you in identifying the print in front of you. And then also we have the identification section, which leads you through very specific information about each particular print. And so I wanted to just show you the compare processes section quickly. And we're just going to compare two processes. Let's do, oh my goodness, silver gelatin studio portrait. And let's just look at that one, for instance. So you can compare two side by side. For essence of time, I'm just going to go ahead and do one. So this is a standard black and white print. This is nothing new and particularly interesting. But it goes over some different things that you want to notice about the print and has descriptions of each of those if you click on it and want more information. You can add a comparison process up here, which is really helpful. You can rotate it, you can change its orientation, and you can actually change your lighting. The lighting is what is really critical, as well as the magnification. So let me just walk you through those tools. Down here, you've got the different magnification steps. So you can just bump up magnification. And there we are, zooming in on the eyeball. So we are now very, very, very close on this poor gentleman's pupil. But this allows you to see the process quite close up. And actually, let me go ahead and add a comparison process to show you something that's going to look quite a bit different. So let's add a cyanotype to this. So you can see when you get under magnification how different processes, barring the fact that a cyanotype is blue and a silver gelatin print is black and white, how different those processes look under the same magnification. And the fact that with the cyanotype you can see all the paper fibers, you can really see the graininess, you can just see the different way that the image material deposits upon the paper surface, which you don't see for multiple reasons that we'll get into a little bit later. See that in the silver gelatin print. What's also useful then is changing the angle of the light. And so now what we have is called raking light, which is taking the light and moving it across the sheet of paper laterally. And so this really shows you the surface topography of the image, which can be exceedingly helpful. So suddenly it's not the image itself that you see, but the surface of the photograph that you see. And that changes dramatically the way you're visualizing this. So we've got a matte surface on a silver gelatin photograph versus a very different type of matte surface on the cyanotype. And you can also have direct overhead light and then the typical light that we use for viewing at about a 45-degree angle. And then lastly, the last thing that I want to show, obviously you can do surface and edge views, you can do front and back. I'm not going to take you through those, but many of these have a little movie clip, and I hope this works for you all. But it takes each photograph and pivots it so that you can actually see the way the light reflects off the surface. This is so cool. At least for those of us who geek out on photo IDs, this is invaluable because it shows you something almost in real time, similar to what you're going to be able to see in front of you. And the way a photograph reflects light is actually really, really critical in understanding the way that that photograph works. So anyway, I'm not going to take any more time showing you this. Just know that this resource is available and that it is absolutely invaluable when you're going to identify photographic processes. So, and it's working. Excellent. Thank you. I'm glad all the little videos are working for you guys. So anyway, this is super cool. The only other thing that I will note is, I'm going to click this off and return back to print, is that it does cover pre-photographic prints. So intaglio is, etchings, engravings, different types of lithographs, different types of woodcuts and wood engravings, and those photomechanical prints that I was talking that I'm not going to be able to cover today, but collotypes, letterpress, Woodbury types, all of those, as well as some digital prints that I'll be covering today. So the expanse of Graphics Atlas is actually wider than what I'm going to be able to cover today. So fantastic resource, and I won't take up any more of your time talking about that. And let's see if I get back to the right screen. Indeed. Excellent. So anyway, those are my top 4 resources. And then I wanted to start with a very basic timeline, and I'm not going to go over this in excruciating detail, but basically one of the first elements of being able to identify what type of photograph you have in front of you is being able to pinpoint about the time that it was produced, because some of these processes do look very similar, even ones that are in the grand timeline of photography actually not that close together. The popularity of different appearances in photographs tends to be cyclical, much like popular fashion. And so we'll see the tendency for, say, some very recent silver gelatin developing out prints to actually look quite a bit like dramatically earlier photographs. And that's just this resurgence in making your photographs look older or more formal. And so knowing when it was produced is often very helpful. So these are the broad timelines that materials, different photographic processes were used. So heliograph was the first photographic process, and that was invented in 1826, followed by the daguerreotype, 1839 to 1860. Salted paper prints were used from about 1840 to sometime in the 1850s. A lot of these died out very slowly, and I will note that all of these can show up later. These are really the popular dates, because any of these can be used by artists who want to use older processes. People are still making daguerreotypes. People are still making salted paper prints. Certainly lots of people are still making cyanotypes because they're fairly easy. If you've made a sun print, you've made a cyanotype, basically, just not with a photographic negative. So all of these processes can still show up in modern prints, but these are the dates that they were popular as popular photographic processes. Platinotypes or platinum prints were invented in 1881 and ran through sometime in the 1930s. Tintypes 1885 to 1900. Amber types 1855 to 1865. You can read all of these. I'm not going to go through all of the dates. But what's important to notice is that a lot of these overlap. So obviously it wasn't, oh, well, we know daguerreotypes and now we're done with daguerreotypes and we're starting cyanotypes and now we're starting this. But in certain periods, there were in some cases 5 or 6 different photographic processes that were all reasonably popular for different reasons. And so it's entirely possible that you can have a broad range of photographs from a very narrow time frame. So that's just one important thing to note. The other important thing that I wanted to note here is that you will notice that all of these sadly now have an end date of 2000. True photographic prints, as far as popular printing goes, are actually all considered dead. They are now strictly an artistic process. Of course, almost none of us have a good old-fashioned film camera anymore, and bless your heart if you still do, but almost all of us have moved to digital. So this is true photography that I'm talking about. Digital prints have really taken over after 2000, and we'll be touching on some of the digital printing processes at the very end of today's workshop. But silver gelatin, traditional black and white photography, as well as modern contemporary color photography, both have officially died as of the year 2000, and we mourn them. Okay, so the first process that I wanted to cover today, I'm going to take my watch off so I make sure that I leave time for some questions here. The first process I wanted to cover very quickly is the heliograph. The heliograph was a blip, but a very important blip on the historic photographic process timeline. This is because really only a handful of them were ever created, and to the best of my knowledge, only one remains, and that was the world's first photograph, which is this image of the rooftops in Paris, and this was by Joseph Niepce. It really has a lot more in common with a printing process than it does with a true photographic process. and requires the reflection of light. It basically just changed the surface reflection on a sheet of metal by hardening, I believe it's gum bichromate, that was treated on the surface and then hardened with exposure to light. And so that hardened surface changes the reflecting property of the metal base that it's on. And so you can see it when light is reflected off of it. And you can see from this image that you need to see the light reflectance on here to be able to see the image. It's actually a remarkably awe-inspiring and yet underwhelming image when you see it in person. But I can guarantee all of you, unless we happen to have someone calling in from the University of Texas at Austin, that none of you have any heliographs in your collection, because to the best of my knowledge, there is only this one, and it is owned by UT Austin. However, many of you may have daguerreotypes. Daguerreotypes were the first popular photographic process, and basically the daguerre took the idea that Niepce had come up with and worked with Niepce a little bit, but then really ran with it to commercialize it and came up with the daguerreotype. And so the first popular photographic process bears the name of daguerre as opposed to Niepce, even though it was Niepce's scientific discovery that really allowed for the daguerreotype. Daguerreotypes are the only photographic process that are truly both a negative and a positive, depending on which way the light is reflected on them. And you can see that in this image here. Very easy to identify daguerreotypes. They are very polished silver plate that have then been exposed to a mercury vapor gas, as well as some other nasties. And so the exposure of that gas and then the exposure to light, again, changes the reflecting property of that highly polished silver-plated metal and burns a photographic image on there. When you look at it under direct light, it appears a negative. But when you look at it under more raking light, so a more angled exposure to the light, you can see the image as a positive. This particular example that you're looking at here has actually been colored, and this is not uncommon. You can see that the rosiness of this chap's face is actually a slightly added hue. And this was, while not commonplace, was certainly not terribly uncommon. Painting little gold dots on buttons or earrings or necklaces or a little pink on the cheeks was fairly common on the higher end daguerreotypes. Most commonly, you're going to see daguerreotypes in these cases, which are called union cases. Some people call them by different names. That's just the word that I hear most commonly referred to when they're discussing cased photographs, as a union case. And these were built to protect the very, very delicate surface of the daguerreotype. You can see that there is some corrosion around the edge, and this is very common for daguerreotypes. Because the silver-plated surface, silver, of course, oxidizes. All of us have seen silver tarnish over time. Silver does oxidize with exposure to air, and although the daguerreotypes are as well sealed as something this early in history could have been sealed, eventually the outside air does begin to leak into this package, and you'll begin to see with that a little bit of corrosion around the edges. And the makeup of this mat, which is called the brass preserver, actually exacerbates that sometimes, because brass is not the most stable of metals and actually can itself create some different corrosion properties that actually then react with the surface of the daguerreotype as well. Sometimes you will find these out of the case, in which case they are usually pretty beaten up. But ideally you want them all packaged and definitely under glass, because the surface of these daguerreotypes is so delicate. Quickly after the daguerreotype came the salted paper print. Historically, the salted paper print is really important because it was produced from a paper negative. So while the daguerreotype was both a negative and a positive in one format, the salted paper print was a negative to positive process. And so this was the first photograph that you could actually produce several of, as opposed to being a direct print. So this is a print where we actually got prints off of a negative and can produce multiple positive images. That said, the runs of salted paper prints were actually quite short. Paper negatives were very delicate. We won't be talking about negatives today, again, to try to compress this down to an hour. But the paper negatives, by their essence, to transmit light through them, had to be very thin paper. And since the printing process was a wet process, getting very thin, almost tissue weight paper wet limited its durability in the printing process. And so we have very few paper negatives left. and they tended to fall apart after a fairly quick printing run, even for the prints themselves. So, but salted paper prints, a few keys to identifying them, other than the fact that they are one of the earliest photographic processes. They are typically very delicate, very fragile items printed on text weight paper. These are not on a particularly heavy paper stock. They are typically not mounted to board, although sometimes they can be. The image that you see here on your far left actually is a piece that has been cut into an oval vignette and has been mounted to a board. But in many cases, these are just little pieces of paper, again, about text weight paper. One of the keys to identifying these is they're always this sort of warm brownish black color. And there is absolutely no reflective, or very little reflective surface to these, because the silver that produces the image on these actually seeps into the paper itself. So this is a very, very magnified cross-section of the paper, again, from the Graphics Atlas. And I will say, I pulled most of these from an earlier version of Graphics Atlas back when they were piloting it. So the images that I have may not be identical to the ones that you'll see on there today, but they give the same information. It may actually be good to have some for comparison's sake. But you can see that the silver image material has actually seeped into the paper itself and stained the paper. And what this means is that when you look at these under that reflected light that I showed you from the Graphics Atlas program, is that these actually have the same surface reflectance as a standard piece of paper. So they appear very matte. They appear to have the same feel as a piece of paper because it hasn't dramatically changed the characteristic surface of the paper that it was printed on. And you can see under magnification that you can actually see the paper fibers very clearly under reasonably low magnification. And then that same magnification under very reflected light shows that although there is a slight surface coating, by and large, the surface is actually unchanged. These are also, I don't want to get, again, too much into preservation and care of materials today, but I think it's worth noting that these are amazingly light sensitive. And so frequently, unless these have been housed, say, closed in an album or otherwise kept in the dark for a very, very long time, these frequently are quite faded out. Cyanotypes are perhaps one of my favorite processes, but are also one of the absolute easiest to identify because they are always blue. If you have a blueprint, chances are exceptionally good that you have a cyanotype. Cyanotypes are chemically exactly the same process as a blueprint. Basically what happens is that you mix a cyanide salt and an iron salt and mix them together, and they became a photosensitive reaction that, when exposed to light, precipitates out the compound Prussian blue, which is, for those of you who have done any painting, is a fairly common blue pigment. That Prussian blue seeps in, and again, we're looking here under a cross-section, seeps in and stains the paper. And so much like the salted paper print, these again have the same feel and same surface as the paper that they were printed on. Under light magnification, again, you can see they're usually a little on the grainy side. The Prussian blue particles are a little on the chunky side. That said, I mean, under normal observation, the photo is quite crisp. But when you get them under magnification, the lines here are not nearly as crisp as some later photographic processes because the Prussian blue pigments just aren't quite as detailed as some of the finer silver particles that later photography develops. So they look a little bit on the grainy side. But under high magnification, you can clearly see paper fibers in the areas, and even through the areas of high image density. And again, that's because there really is nothing sitting on the surface. It's just that Prussian blue staining the paper. These, again, are printed usually on more or less a text weight paper. Those of you who have handled blueprints, which I think people have probably handled blueprints as frequently or more frequently than they have handled cyanotypes, they are usually on this just kind of slightly heavy text weight paper. The photographs can actually be on a slightly lighter weight paper or the same weight that blueprints were done on. So pretty easy identification for those given their hue. Platinum prints, I should say actually that cyanotypes are also a negative to positive process. And I will try to note when things are not through a negative. So cyanotypes could be done off of a paper negative, but more frequently were done off of glass negatives when they were printed. Platinum prints are also a negative to positive process, and they are one of my personal favorites. And the reason for that is that they are remarkably stable, and also give a wonderful, warm, rich black hue. And they were always about this color. They don't tend to change very much. They didn't tend to tone platinum prints very much. The way we'll see for future photographic processes that we'll be talking about were frequently toned with different things to give them different colors. Platinum prints are almost always exactly this color. So the platinum prints are not the first black and white process, but certainly the first resilient black and white process, and salted paper prints tended not to last very long. These, much like their predecessors, also are a pigment that stains the surface of the photograph. So these, again, are also quite matte. You can see in the cross-section how the platinum has just stained the surface. Platinum, as it is in jewelry, as in photographs, is actually a very durable, very desirable metal. These photographs are remarkably stable, far more stable than a lot of contemporary photographs, and certainly far more stable than their predecessors of cyanotypes or of salted paper prints. However, one way that you can help to identify these is that they are remarkably caustic to materials adjacent to them. So if you have a platinum print and you have it stored back to front to something else, be that a piece of paper, be that another photograph, be that a folder, and it's been there for a good long time, you may actually see an image burn on the verso, on the back side of the image that was adjacent to it. That will be a perfect mirror image in brown acidic burn compared to the photographic print itself. And I should have brought a physical example of this. I don't know how well it would have come over the webcam, but to be honest, I just wasn't thinking this morning to grab it when I came to set up my webcam, and I apologize. But if you see that very characteristic brown burn on the reverse side of something that was adjacent to one of these, chances are very good that you have a platinum print. You may have something that has been toned with platinum. That's also a possibility, because even just the toning used in platinum will do that. But the concentration of platinum is quite a bit lower in those, so it's more likely that you have a platinum print. But go ahead and look for that surface reflectance. If you can see paper fibers, if it does look like the image material has completely sunk into the paper substrate itself, you've got yourself a platinum print. If it looks like something's sitting on the surface and you've got more of an emulsion layer, which we'll be seeing lots of examples here in just a few minutes, then chances are you have something that's been toned with platinum. We're going to cover the two collodion processes together, tintypes and ambrotypes. And the reason I want to cover these together is that these are actually often confused if they are in cases. These are frequently cased photographs, similar to the daguerreotypes, or in those union cases, and look very, very similar when they're in their case behind glass. And so I actually have an image of one pulled apart here that is an ambrotype to show you the critical difference between the two. The collodion process in both of these is actually a negative process. The photograph that you are producing itself is actually a negative photograph. The way it is displayed makes them both appear positive. And the reason behind that is that the photograph itself is kind of a creamy gray white, and that's very easy to see here in the ambrotype that's been pulled apart. And if you look at the white image areas of this tintype, that is actually the photographic image. The way that they make both of these processes appear positive is by putting them onto a black background. So with a tintype, what they do is actually lacquer a piece of black iron, ironically, not tin, they're iron. Lacquer a piece of black iron, and then put the collodion emulsion layer, the sensitized collodion, over that black layer, and then expose it to light. When they wash it, then the image areas that are the negative space wash away, but then appear positive because of the black background coming through the white photograph itself. And so these are one solid piece of metal, lacquer, photographic emulsion layer, and then frequently they're cased in a union case behind glass and appear thusly. The ambrotype is a piece of glass where the collodion emulsion layer is painted onto the glass, exposed to light, washed away. The positive image area is washed away, so you're left with a negative of the collodion. But then that is displayed over frequently a little scrap of black velvet, or sometimes a lacquered piece of black metal or black wood, and that glass is placed on top of it in a sandwich. So basically these would layer so that you'd pop the, whoa, that's not what I meant to do, sorry. So that you would pop the velvet into the case and then place the ambrotype and the brass preserver over the top of it. The reason I show these two together is that when they are in the case, they look very, very similar. And I wanted to mention that if you have them in a case, it's best not to try to take them apart. So the best way to identify the difference between the two of them is to actually hold a light magnet to the surface of the glass. The amber types, because they are simply glass, are not magnetic, but the tin types, because they are printed on iron, are actually highly magnetic. And so if you've got a magnetic image, you've got a tin type without having to take it all apart and look at it that way. That said, many tin types now have either never been presented in a union case or have come out of their union case. They're very durable little photographs and have survived very, very well just rattling around in folders and boxes and all sorts of stuff. So it's very frequent for you to find a tin type that's not in any sort of case like this, in which case they're very easy to identify. The amber types more frequently are still stored in their case because they're visually not as translatable without that presentation mode of having them in the case. The next process I wanted to talk about is the albumin process. And this was the first truly popularly embraced photographic process. Albumin prints were wildly popular, and these are the first that if you have a historic photographic process, that you start seeing lots and lots and lots of this process in your collection. The reason behind that is that the albumin prints because they could be mass produced, they were again printed from a negative process, but had a much more robust printing process. They just lended themselves to popular photography and were more cost effective. Basically became the first sort of social calling card, including a photographic image. And so the process or the format that you see albumin prints in most commonly is going to be either in a carte de visite or a calling card. And many of you probably have these in your collections. Carte de visites are small. They're about a little bit smaller than a pack of cigarettes. The picture that you see in front of you actually is a cabinet card, which is the larger format, which is closer to, in some cases, what is that? Just under a foot, probably 10 or 11 inches, it looks like it says there. Both of these are mounted on card. And what these were done is the cabinet cards were really given to people who were loved ones or very close companions and meant to be displayed. The carte de visites, the smaller ones, were actually printed in mass, and then as someone of wealth went around socializing in their circles around town, they would have these carte de visites, which is French for a visiting card or a calling card. And they would actually then hand these out to all of their comrades, friends, socialites, to basically collect more or less, so that you could say, look at all of my friends, effectively. And so that was a very common presentation mode. One of the reasons that this format embraced that or was utilized for that is that albumin prints must be mounted on card. They are almost never found only on the paper they are printed in. The albumin process, and I will be honest that I don't know the reason behind this, but the albumin process is always printed on very, very thin paper. Almost tissue weight, but not quite, but certainly a very light, almost onion skin weight paper. And so the albumin is actually an emulsion layer, which is derived from, kind of early Facebook. Sort of, kind of. But the emulsion layer is made out of albumin. This is still a silver salt-based photograph, as many of these are. The albumin process is egg whites, and as the egg whites dry, they contract. And of course, this is only on one side of the paper, and it contracts far more violently than the gelatin does in many of the later processes. And this causes the paper to curl if it's not mounted and made to lay flat. And so if you find a historic albumin print that isn't mounted to card, chances are it's rolled up into a tube that literally is about the diameter of a pen or pencil. The curl is that dramatic, and they're very difficult to get to lay flat and stay flat. They really have to be forced to lay flat, even under appropriate conditions and everything else. So dollars to donuts, it's going to be mounted on cards when you see an albumin print. And again, the carte de visites and the cabinet cards were the two most popular formats, but we've certainly seen even large portraiture done with albumin prints. Vignetting, the process that you see here with the kind of fuzzy borders, became very, very vogue with the albumin prints and the popularity and trading of these. And so it's very common for albumin prints to have this sort of vignetted edges when you're looking at portraiture. Certainly if you're looking at snapshots and whatnot, that's typically not the case. As far as identification goes, the albumin prints are sort of a hybrid where the silver particles do actually sink into and embed themselves in the paper itself, but there is an albumin layer sitting on top of the paper, which does change the reflectance and the visibility of the paper fibers. So when we look under magnification here, you can see under light magnification, as in not super strong magnification, that you can still see paper fibers, but they don't leap out quite the same way that they did in some of the earlier paper processes like cyanotypes, like salted paper prints, like platinotypes. And when you look at that same magnification under reflected light or in raking light that is reflecting the light, you're able to see that surface coating much more dramatically. And so they actually have quite a bit of shine to them, which a lot of the other photographs did not up to this date. And so they've got quite a bit more reflectance. And in cross-section here, you can see, while you do see the silver staining the paper, it doesn't go quite as deep as some of the others. This is actually a slightly higher magnification because, again, this is even thinner paper than the other processes, and we're looking quite a bit closer in the paper. But you can see way up here at the top a very thin layer that is the albumin layer that coats the paper overall, even in the non-image areas, which is the difference here. One other key to identification with the albumin prints is that over time, and this is more of a preservation concern, but it does help somewhat with identification, is that if you are looking under magnification with these, oftentimes, because the albumin layer does shrink and contract over time, especially with changes in humidity in their storage, you can start to see a really fine crackling pattern on the surface of an albumin print if it's been stressed out environmentally. It doesn't always happen, but if you see that, it is most characteristic of an albumin print. The colors of albumin prints tend to be, again, these very warm browns, kind of sepia tones. These frequently were not tinted. Every once in a while you'll run into one, but most commonly they are this very warm sepia brown color. Carbon prints are a really cool process. These were always an artsy process. You're not going to run into a lot of carbon prints. I actually make an effort to collect different sorts of photographs for this workshop that I do in person so that people can see these in person, which unfortunately for you all actually helps a lot to see these things in person. But the carbon print is one that I've not been able to find a copy of because these are just a fairly rare process. So chances are good if you don't have a terribly large or art-oriented or high-end portraiture-entered collection, chances are good you don't have a ton of carbon prints, if any at all. The carbon print process is interesting in that, A, it uses carbon as opposed to silver. So other than platinum and the cyanotypes, almost every other process uses silver somewhere in forming the image. This one uses carbon. Carbon black or lamp black is a very, very stable pigment. And so these are remarkably stable photographs, which is great from a preservation purpose. They are built up almost topographically. And so hopefully, I'm not sure if I'll be able to toggle through here. If it's going to let me click through because I'm doing this, I'm going to toggle through. Let me finish here and then I'll show you the example of the light reflecting off of this within Graphics Atlas because it really gets this topography across. Under magnification, you end up not seeing any paper fibers at all with a carbon print. And the reason behind this is that it actually has a thick brightening layer that has come to be called the Baryta layer in more modern photography that is layered over the paper to give a very, very smooth white printing surface for this photograph. And so when you look at it under magnification, you do not see any paper through this whatsoever. All you're seeing is the surface of that white coating over the photograph. They are a little on the grainy side. Carbon pigments are quite large, and so you're not seeing quite the crispness with these as you are with some of the more modern silver gelatin-based or silver-based photographs. That said, again, at a normal naked eye glance, they are still quite crisp. Sometimes these are mounted on cards, sometimes not. So this you're seeing here is a cabinet card version that is a carbon print. Again, since these were always artsy prints, these were either for art photography or for very high-end portraiture. So what I'm going to do is bounce back to Graphics Atlas here and pull up a carbon print. So, and then I'll show you, let's see if we can get it just a little bit bigger. There we go. And then I'm going to, this is a photograph of a painting. So just in case y'all are confused, of a very odd, I don't know if that's Dutch master, perhaps, early painting, obviously. And let's see if I can still do the movie full screen, side, front, back, light source. Yeah, it's not going to let me do the FUI. But what I want to do is run this little movie that's going to do that light reflectance again and show you how this works. Because what happens is when they print a carbon print, basically, a kind of more like the printing process is more like that early heliograph. These are coated with a light sensitized gelatin that's impregnated with all of these carbon particles, that's coated over the surface, exposed to light, and the areas that are exposed to light harden, and the areas that don't. And when they wash it away, because the carbon particles are so big, the really dark image areas actually build up and are visibly higher than the areas of low image density, or the white areas. And so when you look at these under reflected light, which we'll get going in just a sec, you can see here how the black areas are very shiny, very reflective, and actually, it's hard to see on this far away, but actually are higher up than the areas of the white image. And this is that buildup of these carbon particles and gelatin over that white layer on top of the paper. And so it gives a very characteristic differential in the surface reflectance. And if we look here at the different light, 0, there we go. You can see it still, you can also see that difference in image reflectance. And if we were to get very, very close up, whoa, too close. Oh, this one doesn't really show it that well. You actually can see basically kind of a step differential between them, but this particular photograph example isn't going to show it very well, unfortunately. I apologize. I don't know if raking is going to do any better. Not much. Nope. So this thing is great for some things, but some things it's just easier to see in person, unfortunately. Okay. So, whoops. I'm back to the beginning. There we go. So the next process that I wanted to cover was the collodion printing out process, commonly called the glossy collodion. And printing out simply means that it was a direct a negative to positive process that was where the image emerged directly with exposure upon light. And every process that we have looked at has been a printing out process up until now, but this is called a collodion printing out process. Collodion images, again, frequently were mounted to card. These came along just slightly after the introduction of albumin prints, and so the vogue of the card-mounted vignette was still very much in place when collodion photography became popular. And so a lot of times you will see collodion images mounted to card. Every once in a while they will not be, but for the most part they are. Collodion images have a very, very thick whitening layer that we see here in the upper right. And that's why they're called glossy collodion. These are almost a mirror image when you see them, if they've been unabraded. So under magnification, you can see here in a white area that you see, of course, absolutely no paper fibers whatsoever because of that really thick whitening layer underneath there. But in addition, all the little blips that you see here are not image material, but are actually just scratches on the surface. Because these were printed with an almost mirror shine, these take abrasion very, very quickly, and so it's very easy to see scratches and pitting on the surface as that very delicate glossy surface was gone over. And good God, it's almost 10 till, and I'm not even through with glossy collodion. I'm going to pick up my pace so we have at least a little time for questions. I'm sorry, I thought I shortened this enough. Regardless, these are what they look at like under magnification. Collodion prints did start being toned, and so you can see these with more purpley tones, more whitish tones. They also experimented with different backgrounds, and so sometimes the backgrounds were slightly like this one, kind of lilac colored or slightly blue in hue. Just varying different aesthetic choices with the photographs. Matte collodion effectively is the same process, but they take out that whole whitening layer. So you can see here on the side that the collodion layer is just now sitting right on the top of the photograph without that big whitening layer. And the difference is similar to an albumin photograph. although there is a shiny coating of collodion over the paper, you can see the paper fibers coming through because you don't have that coating. And so even under magnification, you can see some of those paper fibers coming through the collodion layer. So these tend to have a more matte surface, akin to the albumin print, where there is some gloss to it, but it's a much more matted, muted gloss than the glossy collodion. Silver gelatin printing out is actually one of the hardest to identify because it looks very similar to matte collodion, although it wasn't quite as popular as the matte collodion. Effectively, for preservation purposes, they're really very similar, and the need to differentiate between the two is really more if you're in a museum setting where you're going to exhibit and want to say what type of print that you have. The easiest way to identify between the two, silver gelatin and matte collodion, is to actually take a very, very, very tiny droplet of water and to put it on the edge of the photograph, somewhere obviously that's away from the focus of the photographic image. Sit that droplet of water on the surface of the photograph. If slowly it begins to absorb into the surface of the photograph and the photographic emulsion itself starts to swell, you have a silver gelatin print because the gelatin can absorb water. If it just sits there on the surface and doesn't do anything, you've got a collodion print because the collodion will no longer absorb water. And that's the easiest way to tell the difference between the two, because quite honestly, to the naked eye, these look quite similar. This particular example has a fairly significant baryta layer, but it varies. And it's the silver gelatin printing out that have a very, very thin baryta layer that become very difficult to differentiate between the matte collodion, because otherwise they look quite similar. And the aesthetics of the way they were produced, still often mounted on card, often in calling card and carte de visite format, were very, very aesthetically similar to the matte collodion print. Similar to the glossy collodion in this particular instance, because this one has a very large baryta layer, you can see a whole lot of scratching on the surface, but that is very dependent upon how much baryta they added to the paper, and this is very variable with the silver gelatin printing out. Developing out, we are finally at the black and white process that everybody is familiar with. This is standard black and white photography that was developed out in a chemical solution. So that's the difference between printing out and developing out. Standard black and white photography. When this was first produced in 1885, this was done on paper very similar to every other photographic paper up until that time. But starting in the 1960s, to better facilitate automated photo processing, they introduced resin-coated or RC paper. And that has this acrylic backing on it that makes the photograph very plasticky. And most modern photographs that most of us are used to dealing with are actually on RC or resin-coated paper. And that just allowed for more easily mechanized printing. Quickly, chromogenic prints are by far the most common color process. Actually went back as early as 1941, although really weren't embraced until closer to the 50s. Chromogenic prints are always on RC paper. So you have the resin-coated paper, paper fiber itself, really thick baryta whitening layer, and then the image layer sitting right there up on top. Chromogenic prints tend to be a little on the grainy side and also tend to fade over time, which again, I'm not going to go too far into preservation, but if you've got a color print that has remarkably faded into the sepia, magenta, or yellows, chances are good you've got a chromogenic print. And by far the most popular. If you have a snapshot, you have a chromogenic print. Unless you have a Polaroid or an Instamatic, which is technically called a dye diffusion transfer. These are really easy to ID, though, because all of you, maybe not all of you, I don't know your age, but a lot of you have had experience with the Instamatic Polaroid cameras and the sorts of snapshots that these produced. Popular to common belief, waving them around did not speed up how they were, how they developed. The developing solutions were all actually released as that photographic package was squeezed out of the camera. These are not great for preservation purposes because they contain all of those processing chemicals in them and never release them. They're not terribly good quality. They were really meant kind of as grip and grin, fun, social snapshots were never meant for high-end photographs. So their preservation isn't so great, but a lot of us do end up with them in our collections. Silver dye bleach, most of you are not going to have unless you are in museum settings, but some of you definitely are or may be. These are called, Cibochromes are the most common commercial name for these, also called C-prints. These are very, very bright colored, can be very large format color prints. The colors, when you get right up close to them, are actually quite grainy. But they're great. Part of that is because a lot of times these are large format photographs that were blown up a whole lot. And so some of that graininess is by its very nature from the negatives that it was printed from. These are actually a really stable color process, and the colors on these are super, super vibrant. These are really plasticky papers, and these were only done for art prints. So you're not going to see someone's snapshots on a C print. But if you have art photography that's a really brilliant color on a very, very shiny plasticky paper, almost luminescent, chances are very good that you've actually got this Cibachrome or a C print. And you can actually see in this up close snapshot of the side cut the actual different image layers here of the cyan, magenta, and yellow and black, all forming the image one on top of another. Quickly, digital prints. I will say I'm happy to stay online if people have questions, because I really thought I shortened this enough to leave enough time for questions. I apologize. Digital prints, of course, is the way that all of us have photographs now. Digital printing started as early as 1990, really didn't become truly popular until about the turn of the millennium in 2000. But almost all modern prints that we're seeing now that are not being printed for preservation purposes or for museum or display purposes tend to be some form of digital print. And many higher end prints now are digital as well. Inkjet is by far the most popular and the easiest to spot because its resolution is actually quite poor. These are the different patterns that you can see when you look under just loupe magnification at an inkjet print. Inkjets are, especially like just desk quality inkjets, do not make a terribly fine ink array, which is this pattern that's sprayed out of the different ink heads. Depending on the speed that you're printing, your type of printer, and the fineness of your array, your printing ink can be very small droplets. It can appear very random, or it can actually look quite streaky and almost linear. And that just depends on how quickly your heads spray versus the speed of the paper feeding through underneath the printing heads. But all of them have very distinct little droplets, usually of 3 to 4 colors, depending on what type of printer you have. So if the printer is just cyan, magenta, and yellow, like this piece here at the bottom, they'll get black simply by overlaying those 3 colors in high density. This one, too, on the left, just has those 3 colors. This one here on the right actually has black ink added to it. And so you can clearly see individual droplets of black ink here that's added to it, which really makes the black a lot more dense on these particular photographs. Dye diffusion or dye sublimation, called both, is also quite popular. This is more frequent in the commercial grade digital prints that you get printed out when you send it away to, say, Walgreens or Walmart or Target or wherever that you get your prints printed. Again, you are going to see a very mechanical array of pattern in the image when you get it under magnification. That really quickly displays that you have some sort of mechanical print, not true photographic print. But these dye diffusion ones are not nearly as easily discernible as the inkjet because you don't have nearly as much white paper showing through the image. These 2 images that I have under magnification are under the same level of magnification, one with a fairly cheap dye diffusion printer and one with a much higher end dye diffusion printer. Clearly with the cheaper one, it's much easier to see that array from the printing heads. With the finer one, that is a lot more diffuse, although there still is a distinct linear pattern there. But you're not going to see the white paper showing through on these, an important thing to note. Direct thermal or zinc process is actually a wax-based process where they're melting wax-colored inks directly onto the paper. These are printed off of film in many cases, and as opposed to a paper moving under little heads and spraying ink like the previous 2, this one prints the whole image and moves a heating element over it and then removes it and layers the different colors on top of it. And so under magnification, again, you're going to see a very linear array, but these have a slightly different reflectance. And so another one that, to save time, I'm not going to take you back to the graphics atlas, but this is one that under reflectance actually looks quite a bit different. It has a little bit more reflectance to it, and that helps. This is a much more modern process too, and is typically, again, not terribly common, and this is only done for 4x6 prints. I don't know why, but right now you can only get to direct thermal if you're getting small prints. If you've got a large one, you are not going to get a direct thermal print. And then lastly is electrophotography. I throw this in only, which is Xerox or photocopying. I throw this in because there is a possibility you will see these, although it's not terribly likely that lots of people are printing out photographs on photocopiers. But it does happen, particularly early because, of course, the science of xerography has been around for a very long time. So just showing you what dry toner looks like, has a very, very characteristic kind of buckshot appearance almost under magnification, because the dry toner particles are dusted onto the paper and then fused with heat. So you still have that almost dusty looking pattern under magnification. But then wet toner looks much closer to an inkjet print. And it's actually quite hard to discern between wet toner and inkjet, except that wet toner doesn't have nearly the resolution. This is a much grainier looking image. There's a lot less control over the blobs and how they're laid out. So just generally the xerography doesn't look as high-end as a decent inkjet print does. Oftentimes xerography also will be on standard printing paper as opposed to photographic paper, which also helps. So with that, didn't leave quite as much time for questions as I would have hoped. But this is my contact information, and I'm going to flip back really quickly now to the chat and see if folks have any questions. And I apologize for the interference there with the technology and not being able to see chat while I was doing this. But let me get out of PowerPoint and head back. And so wanted to see if folks had any additional questions that I could answer about photographs, or anything specifically from their questions that they had questions about. Or have I lulled you all to absolute silence?
Jennifer, when you were talking about carbon...
Someone is typing. Lots of...
Hi. Thanks for that great presentation. Inspired me to go back and start looking at photographs under magnification. It's really fascinating. When you were talking about carbon prints, did you see Dan wrote in a question about, is it sort of a 3D effect because of that building?
It is. Under magnification, it's hard with your naked eye to see that it's three-dimensional, but certainly when you're looking at it under like a handheld magnifier, you can actually see a little 3D effect there. Yeah. Let's see. Lewis asks if my PowerPoint screens will be available on the website. The entire webinar will be available on the website. Bronwyn, I'm not sure how quickly we get these posted up, but I know this entire piece is being archived and posted up on the ICPN website. So yes, they will be available. Booth Library asks, how stable is the direct thermal printing process? Reasonably stable. I said I'm not going to go too far into preservation with today's lecture. That really is going to be more the focus of the next preservation lecture on the 18th. But because it's wax-based and it's a thermal process, obviously dramatic changes in temperature are really not good for it, because you can actually see some, not feathering, but softening of the image, and it can actually get sticky next to something that it's stored next to if you keep these things quite warm. Otherwise, it's actually reasonably good because the colorants that are used are actually pigment-based as opposed to dye-based. And I'll go into that in much more detail in the subsequent photographic preservation webinar. But pigment images are always far more stable than dye-based images when you're talking about color. So yes, they are quite a bit more stable. What is the life expectancy of a digital photo? Kathy, do you mean the digital file, or do you mean the photographic print? Because that is very different. The print itself, it really depends on the printing process and how it's stored. I mean, and that's the same for all of these, unfortunately. All of these, if you store it in a crummy environment, are going to have a limited lifetime. Some are more resilient and more stable than others. Digital photographs, particularly inkjets, are exceedingly susceptible to high humidity and water vapor, and actually can show pretty significant feathering and bleeding pretty early on. Any of the images that are dye-based, so most of the inkjets, except for pigment-based inkjets, which are very expensive, as well as the thermal process that we talked about, are all dye-based. And so those will often fade with direct exposure to light, or even just with temperature and humidity changes, they can actually fade. So none of them are terribly stable. And so you were asking about the print. Okay. Cheryl, let's see. Yes, usually get the archive posted within a day or two. So it'll be up pretty quickly. But you do have my email, and it will be posted to this. So if you have any additional questions, please do feel free to email me. Barb asks, the best photo webinar. Oh, well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks. The print, thanks. Okay, really? No other questions? That's it? Oh, Ann Lindsay will ask me a question. I know Ann. Oh, that's it? Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, then since we are at 12:05, I certainly don't want to run us over any more than we have to. So I apologize for not leaving as much time for questions as I had wanted to. I said I thought I'd shorten this up, but I always end up babbling.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks to everyone.